The cruelest part about loving your best friend is not watching them fall in love with someone else. It is smiling while helping them celebrate a future that does not include you. The wedding invitation arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, tucked neatly inside a cream-colored envelope with my name written in Ryan Mitchell's unmistakable handwriting. Even before I opened it, I already knew what was inside. Ryan had called me 3 weeks earlier to tell me that he and Daniel had finally set the date after nearly 2 years of planning. I remembered congratulating him with a smile that sounded convincing enough over the phone, then spending the rest of the evening sitting alone in my apartment staring out the window while the city lights blurred behind the rain. Now the invitation rested in my hands, heavier than a simple piece of paper had any right to be. Inside, everything looked exactly the way Ryan would have wanted. Elegant lettering, soft blue accents, a small handwritten note at the bottom. Would not be the same without you, brother. See you at the bachelor party. I laughed quietly to myself. Ryan had called me brother since we were 12 years old, back when we spent every Saturday riding our bikes through the neighborhood until the streetlights came on. We survived awkward middle school years together, celebrated college acceptance letters together, helped each other move into first apartments, and somehow remained inseparable through every stage of adulthood. Everyone assumed we would still be sitting beside each other in nursing homes someday, arguing over football scores and bad coffee. They were probably right. The only thing nobody ever knew was that somewhere along the way, friendship had quietly become something much more complicated for me. I never planned for it to happen. There was no dramatic moment, no unforgettable confession, no single glance that changed everything. It happened through thousands of ordinary days. Ryan remembering exactly how I took my coffee without asking. Ryan showing up with jumper cables when my car refused to start during a snowstorm. Ryan driving 6 hours to attend my father's retirement party because he said family celebrations were too important to miss. Love had never arrived like lightning. It had grown slowly inside years of loyalty until I stopped noticing where friendship ended. A notification on my phone interrupted my thoughts. Ryan had sent a message. Bachelor party this Saturday. Do not even think about making an excuse. You are coming early because I need help setting everything up. I smiled despite myself and typed back that I would be there. Less than a minute later, my phone rang. I knew you would try to text instead of calling. Ryan laughed as soon as I answered. You know me too well, I replied. That is because I have had 20 years of practice. His familiar voice carried the same effortless warmth it always had, making it almost impossible to remember that by next weekend, he would officially become someone else's husband. Daniel keeps telling me not to stress over every little detail, Ryan admitted. But I still feel like I am forgetting something. You are getting married, Ryan. I think being nervous is allowed. He laughed again. That is why I need you Saturday. You always know how to calm me down. I looked toward the invitation still resting on my kitchen table and swallowed the lump forming in my throat. I will be there, I promised quietly. I would not miss it. After we ended the call, I stood in silence for several long minutes before carefully placing the invitation back inside its envelope. I told myself this weekend was about celebrating my best friend, about supporting the person who had stood beside me through every chapter of my life. I repeated those words until they almost sounded believable. Deep down, however, another thought refused to disappear. If one unforgettable night had the power to change everything, I prayed it would not be the night I finally had to say goodbye to the only person who had ever truly felt like home. Saturday arrived with bright blue skies and the kind of crisp autumn air that made the whole city feel alive. I pulled into the driveway of the lake house Ryan had rented for the bachelor party just after 9 in the morning, exactly as he had asked. Before I even stepped out of my car, the front door flew open and Ryan walked down the porch steps with the same easy smile that had somehow remained unchanged since we were teenagers. You are late by 3 minutes, he called out with exaggerated disappointment. I looked at my watch and laughed. I thought today was supposed to be relaxing. Not until everything is ready. He grabbed one of the grocery bags from my back seat before I could protest. Come on. I need your opinion on everything, because apparently Daniel thinks I cannot choose decorations without creating an international crisis. Inside, the house buzzed with quiet excitement. Boxes of snacks covered the kitchen island, coolers waited on the back deck overlooking the lake, and speakers filled the living room with classic rock songs that Ryan and I had listened to since college. We spent the next 2 hours arranging chairs, carrying supplies, and joking about how neither of us had imagined adulthood would involve debating the correct placement of folding tables. It felt strangely comforting. For a little while, nothing had changed. Ryan still stole chips from unopened bags before guests arrived. He still hummed songs completely off-key while working. He still laughed at his own terrible jokes before anyone else had the chance. Every familiar habit reminded me why loving him had never been a decision. It had simply become part of who I was. By early afternoon, the rest of the guests began arriving. Friends from college, co-workers, cousins, and neighbors gradually filled the backyard with conversation and laughter. Everyone wanted pictures with Ryan. Everyone wanted to tell old stories. And everyone seemed genuinely excited about the wedding only a week away. I stayed close enough to help whenever Ryan needed something, but far enough away to let him enjoy the attention. Every now and then he looked across the crowd until he found me, raising his drink with a grin before returning to another conversation. It was such a small gesture that nobody else would have noticed, yet somehow it made the crowded backyard feel a little less lonely. As sunset painted the lake in shades of orange and gold, someone suggested gathering around the fire pit. One by one, people began sharing funny memories about Ryan. Stories from high school football games, disastrous camping trips, and unforgettable road trips filled the evening with constant laughter. Then one of Ryan's cousins pointed toward me. Ethan has known him the longest. Your turn. Dozens of eyes turned in my direction. I smiled and stood slowly, holding a paper cup of cider that suddenly felt much heavier than before. Honestly, I began, there are too many stories to choose from. Ryan leaned back in his chair with an amused smile. Just make sure you leave out the one about the broken skateboard. Everyone laughed. I looked at him for a long second before speaking again. The truth is, Ryan has always been the first person to show up whenever someone needed help. He celebrates other people's victories like they are his own, remembers birthdays without reminders, and somehow makes every place feel a little more like home. My voice remained steady, but every word carried feelings I could never say aloud. Ryan's smile softened as he listened. Whoever gets to build a future with you, I continued carefully, is incredibly lucky. The group applauded while Ryan looked down at the fire for just a moment before quietly meeting my eyes again. There was something different in his expression this time, something thoughtful that lingered longer than usual. For reasons I could not explain, it felt as though those simple words had reached a place inside him that neither of us had expected them to touch. Most of the guests drifted inside the lake house as the evening grew colder, but I stayed outside beside the dying fire, watching tiny sparks disappear into the dark sky above the water. The laughter from inside, mixed with quiet music drifting through the open windows, creating the strange feeling that I was standing between two different worlds. One belonged to celebration. The other belonged to goodbye. I heard the back door slide open behind me before familiar footsteps crossed the wooden deck. I figured I would find you out here, Ryan said as he walked over carrying 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. He handed one to me without asking because after 20 years, he already knew I preferred it over coffee at night. You disappeared, he added. I smiled faintly. I thought everyone deserved some time with the groom. Ryan leaned against the railing overlooking the lake. I have spent most of the night talking to everyone else. He looked toward me with an easy smile. I wanted a few minutes with my best friend. We stood quietly for a while, listening to the gentle sound of small waves reaching the dock. Finally, Ryan laughed to himself. Do you remember this place? I looked around before realizing what he meant. This is where your parents rented that cabin after our high school graduation. Exactly. He shook his head in disbelief. We stayed awake until almost sunrise talking about what our lives would look like when we turned 30. I laughed. Your predictions were terrible. Yours were not much better. I was convinced I would become a famous travel photographer. And I was absolutely certain I would move to California. We both laughed harder than we had all evening. Then Ryan became unexpectedly quiet. There was one promise we actually kept. I looked at him curiously. Which one? He smiled toward the lake. We said no matter what happened, we would never become strangers. The words settled gently between us. I remembered that night perfectly now. 2 18-year-old boys sitting on the end of a dock, convinced adulthood was still impossibly far away. Back then, everything had seemed simple. We believed friendship could survive anything because we had never imagined life pulling us in different directions. We did keep that promise, I answered softly. Ryan nodded, but did not look convinced. Did we? I frowned. What do you mean? He let out a slow breath. Lately, I feel like I have been running toward this wedding so fast that I forgot to stop and ask whether the people who matter most are really okay. I forced a reassuring smile. You do not have to worry about me. That is exactly what worries me. I stared at him in confusion. At the fire pit tonight, when you were talking, he hesitated before continuing. It sounded less like a toast and more like someone saying goodbye. My heart skipped. I looked down into my untouched mug, searching for an answer that would not reveal too much. Maybe I was just feeling nostalgic. Ryan studied my face for several quiet seconds before speaking again. You know something strange? He asked. Out of everyone here tonight, the only opinion I keep worrying about is yours. I tried to laugh it off. That is because I have known you the longest. Maybe. He looked back across the lake where moonlight shimmered across the calm water. Or maybe because every important memory I have somehow includes you. Neither of us spoke after that. The silence was not uncomfortable. It felt thoughtful, almost unfinished, as though both of us sensed there was a conversation waiting just beyond the words we were still too afraid to say. When someone inside called Ryan's name, he finally smiled and lightly tapped my shoulder before heading back toward the house. I watched him disappear through the doorway, unable to ignore the feeling that the memories we had just shared were no longer simply stories about our past. Somehow, without either of us intending it, they had quietly become questions about our future. The party finally began to wind down a little after midnight. One by one, guests claimed bedrooms inside the lake house or stretched out on couches after long hours of laughter, card games, and stories that somehow became more exaggerated every time they were retold. The music grew quieter until only the crackling fire outside and the occasional sound of the lake remained. I was loading empty cups into a trash bag when Ryan walked into the kitchen carrying 2 bottles of sparkling water. Come with me, he said with a small smile. There is one tradition we forgot. I frowned. What tradition? The dock. I laughed softly. Apparently, every important conversation in our lives happens on a dock. Maybe we should stop questioning it. We stepped outside into the cool night air, following the familiar wooden path toward the water. The moon reflected across the lake so clearly that it almost looked like another world floating beneath us. We sat at the edge of the dock with our feet hanging over the side, exactly as we had done countless times before. Neither of us seemed eager to break the silence. It was Ryan who finally spoke first. Do you remember senior year when everyone thought we would end up living together forever? I smiled at the memory. Mrs. Collins actually asked whether we were planning to become roommates after college. Ryan laughed. She said we acted like an old married couple before either of us had even dated anyone seriously. I shook my head, smiling. We thought it was hilarious. Was it? His question caught me off guard. I turned toward him, unsure whether he was joking, but his expression remained calm and thoughtful. Ryan. He stared across the water before answering. Lately, I keep thinking about all those little moments we laughed off because they seemed ridiculous at the time. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Maybe they were not as ridiculous as we believed. I felt my heartbeat become noticeably louder. What are you trying to say? He let out a slow breath. When everyone started talking about my wedding tonight, I kept looking for you. I forced a small smile. That is because we have always looked out for each other. No, he gently shook his head. It felt different. He looked down at the bottle, turning slowly between his hands. Every time someone congratulated me, I kept wondering why it did not feel complete until I saw your face. The quiet honesty in his voice made it impossible to answer immediately. Ryan, I whispered. He continued before I could find the right words. Daniel is a wonderful person. He has never given me a reason to doubt him. He deserves honesty more than anything else. His shoulders lowered with visible exhaustion. But tonight, when you spoke at the fire pit and when we talked afterward, something inside me refused to stay quiet anymore. A long silence followed. I stared at the moonlight dancing across the water while memories flooded my mind with overwhelming clarity. Every birthday, every road trip, every holiday dinner, every difficult season we had survived together. Somehow, every chapter of my life began with Ryan standing beside me. I never wanted to make your life more complicated. I finally admitted. That is why I never said anything. Ryan slowly turned toward me. Said what? I closed my eyes for only a moment before answering with complete honesty. that somewhere along the way, you stopped being just my best friend." The words hung gently in the cool night air. Ryan did not look shocked. Instead, he smiled with quiet sadness, as though hearing something he had been expecting for much longer than either of us realized. "I was afraid you were going to say that," he admitted softly. My chest tightened. "Because you do not feel the same?" He held my gaze for several endless seconds before giving the only answer that truly changed everything. "No," he whispered, "because I think I have been trying not to feel the same for far too long." Neither of us moved after those words. The lake remained perfectly still, reflecting the moonlight as though the entire world had paused to listen. I searched Ryan's face for uncertainty, but all I found was relief mixed with fear. It was the expression of someone who had carried the same secret for years and had finally become too exhausted to hide it. Ryan looked down at his hands before speaking again. "Do you know what scares me the most?" he asked quietly. I shook my head. Not that I admitted this. He let out a slow breath. "What scares me is realizing that after saying it out loud, I cannot pretend anymore." The weight of his words settled between us. For years I had imagined what it would feel like to hear Ryan admit that he loved me too. I had expected excitement, happiness, maybe even disbelief. Instead, what I felt most was compassion. His life was no longer only his own. In less than a week, he was supposed to stand beside Daniel and promise a future built on honesty, loyalty, and trust. Those promises deserve to be real. "Ryan," I said gently, "you cannot make any decisions tonight." He smiled sadly. "You already know what I am thinking. I know you are overwhelmed." "No," he looked directly into my eyes. "I know the difference between panic and clarity." He paused before continuing. "For the first time since I proposed to Daniel, everything suddenly makes sense, and that is exactly why it hurts." I remained silent, allowing him the space to continue. "Daniel has always been kind to me," Ryan said. "He has been patient, supportive, and honest. None of this is because he did something wrong." His voice became quieter. "The problem is that I kept believing friendship could explain feelings that had already become something else." I remembered every moment that now seemed different. Every invitation Ryan accepted without hesitation if I was going. Every holiday he insisted we spend together before visiting anyone else. Every time he called me first after receiving good news. None of those memories felt ordinary anymore. They fit together like pieces of a picture neither of us had wanted to see. "What are you going to do?" I finally asked. Ryan stared across the water for a long time before answering. "I cannot marry someone while wondering if I am giving the biggest part of my heart to someone else." Hearing those words filled me with equal parts hope and guilt. "I never wanted to be the reason your life became more difficult." Ryan immediately shook his head. "You are not the reason." He offered a tired smile. "You are the reason I finally stopped lying to myself." The cool breeze carried the scent of pine trees across the lake as the first hint of dawn began to soften the darkness along the horizon. We had talked through almost the entire night without noticing the hours passing. Eventually, Ryan stood and looked back toward the quiet lake house, where every guest still believed the wedding plans remained unchanged. "I need to speak with Daniel," he said softly. "He deserves complete honesty before anything else happens." I nodded, even though my heart was racing. "Whatever happens next, make sure your decision comes from truth, not fear." Ryan stepped closer and placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, the same familiar gesture that had comforted me countless times throughout our friendship. "Thank you," he said, "not for loving me. Thank you for respecting everyone enough to stay silent until tonight." I smiled faintly. "I thought protecting your happiness mattered more than mine." Ryan looked at me with quiet emotion. "Maybe the hardest lesson we both had to learn is that real happiness cannot grow from pretending." As the first rays of sunrise spread across the lake, we slowly walked back toward the house together, both understanding that when morning fully arrived, nothing about the future would ever feel the same again. Morning arrived far more quietly than I expected. The drive back from the lake house felt shorter than usual because neither Ryan nor I tried to fill the silence with unnecessary conversation. We both understood that the most important words had already been spoken beneath the stars. Everything that remained had to be handled with honesty, patience, and respect. Before leaving the parking lot, Ryan looked over at me with tired but steady eyes. "I'm going to talk to Daniel today," he said. "No more waiting." I nodded slowly. "He deserves the truth." "He does." Ryan rested both hands on the steering wheel before continuing. And so do I. We drove away in opposite directions, each carrying a future that looked completely different from the one we had imagined only 24 hours earlier. I spent the rest of the day unable to focus on anything. I tried reading. I cleaned my apartment twice. I even opened my laptop to answer work emails before realizing I had been staring at the same message for almost 20 minutes without typing a single word. Every few minutes I glanced at my phone, wondering whether Ryan had already spoken with Daniel or whether he was still searching for the courage to begin the conversation. Late that afternoon, my phone finally rang. Ryan's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Ryan quietly said, "It is over." I closed my eyes, hearing both sadness and relief in his voice. "Are you all right?" He let out a long breath. "I think I will be." Another pause followed before he continued. Daniel listened to everything without interrupting. I told him that none of this was because of anything he had done. I told him he deserved someone who could stand beside him without uncertainty. His voice became softer. He thanked me for telling the truth before we made promises that neither of us could honestly keep. My heart tightened with respect for both of them. That could not have been easy. It was the hardest conversation I have ever had. Ryan paused again, but it was also the most honest one. News traveled faster than either of us expected. By the following morning, close friends and family members had learned that the wedding would not take place. There were questions, confusion, and disappointment from people who had been looking forward to celebrating. Ryan answered each conversation with the same calm sincerity. He never blamed anyone else. He never spoke negatively about Daniel. He simply explained that entering a lifelong commitment without complete certainty would have been unfair to everyone involved. That quiet honesty earned far more understanding than either of us expected. 2 days later, Ryan asked if we could meet at the small neighborhood park where we had played baseball as children. The familiar walking path looked almost unchanged despite the passing years. He was already sitting on a wooden bench beneath a large oak tree when I arrived. As soon as he saw me, he stood and smiled with a mixture of exhaustion and peace. "It feels strange," he admitted. "For the first time in months, I do not feel like I am pretending." I sat beside him, allowing the afternoon breeze to carry away the silence between us. "How is Daniel?" I asked carefully. Ryan looked toward the trees before answering. He said he hopes we both find the life we are honestly looking for. A grateful smile crossed my face. "He sounds like a remarkable person." "He is." Ryan nodded. "That is exactly why I could not continue living a life that was not completely true." He turned toward me with quiet certainty, the weight that had burdened him for so long finally gone from his expression. "Now that everything has changed," he said softly, "I would like to discover what our future looks like when neither of us has to hide anymore." The weeks that followed felt less like the beginning of something new and more like learning how to walk through familiar places with completely different hearts. Ryan and I did not rush into changing anything simply because we had finally admitted how we felt. Instead, we gave ourselves permission to rediscover each other without pretending. We still met for breakfast every Saturday morning at the same neighborhood diner where the waitress already knew our usual orders before we sat down. We still argued over football predictions, still laughed at stories we had heard 100 times before, and still spent long evenings talking about work, family, and dreams for the future. The only difference was that every conversation now carried an honesty that had been missing for years. One Saturday morning, as we walked through the downtown farmers market with paper cups of coffee warming our hands, Ryan stopped in front of a small stand selling handmade wooden picture frames. He picked one up, turning it over thoughtfully before smiling. "Do you remember that old photo from high school graduation?" he asked. I laughed. "The one where you insisted your tie looked perfect even though it was completely crooked?" "Exactly that one." He smiled with quiet affection. "I think it deserves a better frame." I watched him carefully. "You have been thinking about the past a lot lately." Ryan nodded. "Not because I want to live there." He glanced toward me with calm certainty. "Because I finally understand it." We continued walking through the market as local musicians played soft acoustic songs nearby, and families browsed fresh produce beneath colorful tents. Everything around us felt wonderfully ordinary, yet I noticed how often Ryan instinctively slowed his pace so we could keep walking side by side. It was such a small habit that I had never questioned before. Now it seemed to explain countless little moments throughout our friendship. Later that afternoon, we drove to Ryan's parents' house for dinner. I had been invited so many times over the years that their home almost felt like my own. His mother greeted me with a warm hug before insisting I take home extra homemade pie afterward, exactly as she always had. During dinner, she looked at both of us with gentle curiosity. I have not seen either of you this relaxed in months, she observed. Ryan exchanged a quick glance with me before smiling. I think we finally stopped trying to force our lives into plans that did not really belong to us. She studied him for a moment before reaching across the table and squeezing his hand. The right decisions are not always the easiest ones, she said softly. But I would rather see you honest than simply comfortable. Her quiet understanding filled the room with unexpected peace. After dinner, Ryan and I sat together on the old porch swing while the sun slowly disappeared beyond the trees. She knows, I said quietly. Ryan smiled. Parents usually know more than we think. A comfortable silence settled between us before he spoke again. For years I believed that choosing the safe path would protect everyone. He looked toward the fading sunset. Instead, it almost kept me from building the life that actually feels true. I leaned back against the porch, listening to the familiar sounds of crickets beginning their evening song. Do you regret anything? I asked. Ryan considered the question carefully before answering. I regret waiting so long to understand my own heart. He smiled gently before adding, but I do not regret where it finally led me. Hearing those words, I realized that our story had never really been about one canceled wedding or one unexpected confession. It had always been about two lifelong friends finding the courage to choose honesty over fear, trusting that the strongest relationships are not built on perfect timing, but on years of loyalty, patience, and the willingness to finally tell the truth. Autumn slowly gave way to winter, and somewhere between ordinary mornings and quiet evenings, Ryan and I stopped wondering whether our lives had changed because we finally accepted that they already had. There was no dramatic moment announcing a new beginning. Instead, it happened through dozens of small choices that felt completely natural. Ryan would call me after work simply to ask whether I wanted to take a walk before dinner. I would bring over homemade soup whenever I knew he had been buried in meetings all day. We continued doing the same things we had always done together, but now every shared moment carried a quiet certainty instead of unanswered questions. One Friday afternoon, Ryan surprised me by asking if I wanted to visit the small downtown art festival that returned every winter. You always skip it because you think it is too cold, I reminded him with a smile. He laughed. Maybe I finally realized that the company matters more than the weather. The festival filled several city blocks with handmade artwork, warm lights, live acoustic music, and local cafes serving hot chocolate and fresh pastries. Families wandered through decorated streets while children admired colorful window displays. Ryan and I walked without any particular destination, stopping whenever something caught our attention. At one booth, an elderly artist displayed watercolor paintings of quiet lakes, mountain cabins, and winding country roads. Ryan studied one landscape for a long time before turning toward me. Does this remind you of the lake house? He asked softly. I smiled immediately because I knew exactly which memory he meant. The bachelor party changed everything, I admitted. At the time I thought it was the night I would lose you forever. Ryan looked down for a brief moment before answering. I thought it was the night I finally understood who had always been standing beside me. We continued walking in comfortable silence until we reached a small pedestrian bridge overlooking a frozen creek. Snowflakes drifted gently through the evening sky, covering the wooden railings with a thin layer of white. Ryan rested his hands on the railing and looked toward the quiet water below. There is something I have wanted to tell you, he said. Go ahead. He smiled to himself before speaking. After I canceled the wedding, I kept asking myself whether people would always remember me as the man who walked away. I listened carefully without interrupting. Then my father told me something I will never forget. He said people eventually stop remembering the day you changed your plans. They remember whether you built an honest life afterward. His words settled warmly inside me. I think he was right, I answered. Ryan turned toward me with calm confidence. I finally believe that too. As we began walking back through the festival, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Daniel. I hesitated before opening it, then quietly smiled. Ryan noticed immediately. Everything okay? I handed him the phone. Daniel had written only a few simple sentences. He thanked both of us for choosing honesty instead of pretending, wished us happiness in whatever future we built together, and said he had recently accepted a new opportunity in another state where he hoped to begin a fresh chapter of his own life. Ryan read the message slowly before handing the phone back, with visible relief. "He deserves every happiness," he said sincerely. "He does," I agreed. As we continued walking beneath glowing holiday lights, I realized that healing does not always mean forgetting painful moments. Sometimes healing means knowing that everyone involved is finally free to pursue a life built on truth, kindness, and hope. For the first time in many years, the future no longer felt uncertain. It simply felt honest, and somehow that made it more beautiful than anything I had ever imagined. Nearly a year has passed since that unforgettable weekend at the lake house, and sometimes I still find myself thinking about how close we came to spending the rest of our lives believing that silence was the same as sacrifice. Looking back now, I understand that the greatest turning points rarely announce themselves with certainty. They arrive disguised as ordinary moments, waiting for someone to finally tell the truth. Ryan and I still return to the lake every autumn, always choosing the same quiet dock where everything changed. The tradition no longer feels bittersweet. Instead, it reminds us how honesty transformed what once felt impossible into something wonderfully ordinary. This year we packed sandwiches, hot coffee, and the old framed graduation photograph Ryan had bought at the farmer's market months earlier. We placed it between us on the dock and laughed at our younger selves, two awkward teenagers convinced they already understood everything about life. Ryan shook his head with an amused smile. If someone had told 18-year-old me how this story would end, I never would have believed it. I laughed. 18-year-old me would have been too afraid to believe it. The afternoon drifted by with easy conversation, gentle teasing, and the familiar comfort that had always existed between us. The difference now was that neither of us felt the need to hide behind friendship whenever our hearts quietly asked for something more. As the sun began lowering toward the horizon, Ryan reached into his backpack and pulled out a small notebook. "I found this while cleaning my apartment," he explained. Inside were pages filled with old bucket lists we had written together throughout college. Visit every national park. Drive across the country. Learn to cook something besides pasta. Open a coffee shop someday. Most of the ideas were unrealistic, but reading them together filled the afternoon with laughter. Then we reached the final page. Written in Ryan's unmistakable handwriting were the words, "No matter where life takes us, always make time for each other." Ryan looked at the sentence for several quiet seconds before smiling. "Out of everything we wrote, this is the one promise we never broke." I nodded gently. Maybe that is why we found our way back. As evening settled over the lake, we packed our things and began walking toward the parking lot. Halfway down the trail, Ryan slowed his pace and looked back at the calm water reflecting the fading colors of the sky. "Do you know what I have learned from all of this?" he asked. "Tell me." He smiled with quiet certainty. "Love is not measured by dramatic moments. It is measured by who continues choosing to walk beside you after life becomes ordinary again." I looked at the familiar path stretching ahead of us and realized he was absolutely right. The happiest part of our story had never been the confession beneath the stars or the difficult decisions that followed. It was everything that came afterward. The peaceful mornings, the shared laughter, the quiet support, the trust built over decades, and the simple comfort of knowing that neither of us had to pretend anymore. Sometimes people ask whether I regret the years we spent hiding our feelings. I always give the same answer. I wish we had found our courage sooner, but I do not regret the journey that brought us here because every ordinary day we shared helped build the kind of love that could survive honesty, change, disappointment, forgiveness, and time itself. In the end, the greatest gift life ever gave us was not a perfect plan or perfect timing. It was the chance to discover that the person we had been searching for had quietly been walking beside us through every chapter, patiently waiting until we were finally brave enough to recognize that home had never been a destination. Home had always been each other. Life continued to move forward in the quiet, dependable way it always had. But now every ordinary day carried a sense of gratitude that neither Ryan nor I took for granted. We no longer measured our happiness by dramatic milestones. Instead, we found it in routines that once seemed too simple to matter. Every Saturday morning still began with breakfast at the same neighborhood diner, where the waitress greeted us with the same warm smile and already knew exactly what we would order. We still debated football scores that neither of us could control, still challenged each other to ridiculous trivia games during long drives, and still wandered through bookstores promising we would not buy another novel before leaving with bags that were somehow heavier than when we arrived. One afternoon in early spring, our office organized a volunteer event at a community art center where local children spent weekends learning to paint and draw. Since I had started sketching regularly again, our manager asked whether I would help lead one of the beginner classes. I almost declined out of nervousness, but Ryan smiled the moment he heard the idea. "You spent years encouraging everyone else to believe in themselves," he said. "Maybe it is finally time you believe in yourself too." His confidence gave me enough courage to accept. The class turned out to be one of the happiest afternoons I had experienced in years. The children were more interested in imagination than perfection, filling every page with colorful landscapes, oversized trees, and cheerful houses beneath enormous blue skies. One little boy proudly showed me a drawing of two people standing beside a lake at sunset. "They are best friends," he explained with complete certainty. "They always go everywhere together." I smiled warmly and told him it was a beautiful picture. Ryan, who had been helping organize supplies across the room, quietly glanced toward the drawing before meeting my eyes with a knowing smile. Neither of us needed to say anything. Later that evening, we stopped at our favorite coffee shop before walking through the city park as the sun slowly disappeared behind rows of blooming trees. Families pushed strollers along winding paths, teenagers laughed together on nearby benches, and musicians played gentle acoustic songs beneath a gazebo. The entire park felt peaceful, reminding me how extraordinary ordinary life could become when shared with the right person. Ryan looked around before speaking. "Do you remember how worried we were after everything happened?" I nodded. "I thought the future would always feel uncertain." He smiled softly. "Instead, it finally feels honest." We continued walking until we reached a small wooden bridge overlooking a quiet pond where ducks drifted lazily across the water. Ryan rested his arms on the railing and looked toward the reflection of the evening sky. "I used to believe love was supposed to completely change your life," he admitted. "Now I think real love simply allows you to become more yourself." I stood beside him, thinking about everything we had experienced together over the years. He was right. Neither of us had become different people. We had simply stopped hiding the people we had always been. Looking back, I realized the bachelor party had never truly been the ending of one story. It had become the beginning of another, one built not on impossible promises or perfect timing, but on decades of trust, friendship, forgiveness, and the quiet courage to choose truth over fear. Sometimes the happiest ending is not a single unforgettable moment. Sometimes it is waking up every day beside the person who has known your heart for years and finally knowing that neither of you has to hide from it ever again. Another summer arrived before either of us realized how quickly time had passed. The anniversary of the canceled wedding no longer felt like a painful reminder. Instead, it became a quiet reminder of the day honesty finally outweighed fear. Ryan and I decided to spend the weekend at the same lake house where everything had first begun to change. As we drove along the familiar country roads with the windows down and our favorite playlist filling the car, I caught myself smiling at how ordinary the trip felt. A year earlier, I had believed I was driving toward heartbreak. Now I understood I had unknowingly been driving toward the most honest chapter of my life. The lake greeted us with the same peaceful water, the same weathered dock, and the same gentle breeze moving through the tall pine trees. Very little had changed. Yet everything felt different because we had changed. After unpacking our bags, Ryan disappeared into the kitchen and returned carrying 2 mugs of coffee exactly the way he always did. "Some traditions should never change," he said with a grin. I accepted the mug and laughed. "I was hoping you would say that." We spent the afternoon kayaking across the quiet lake, stopping occasionally just to admire the reflections dancing across the water. There was no pressure to make the day extraordinary because we had finally learned that happiness rarely demanded dramatic moments. It simply asked us to notice the ones already in front of us. That evening, we prepared dinner together on the back deck while the sun slowly settled behind the trees. Ryan insisted on handling the grill while I organized the side dishes, and we spent more time laughing about our terrible cooking experiments from college than actually preparing the meal. At one point, Ryan looked at me with the same amused expression he had worn for years. "You know," he said. I used to imagine what life would look like if I had made different choices. I looked up from the table. Do you still? He gently shook his head. Not anymore. He paused before continuing. Because every road that brought me here also brought me back to you. Those simple words carried more comfort than any grand declaration ever could. After dinner, we walked down to the dock, carrying lightweight folding chairs, watching stars gradually appear across the clear summer sky. The silence between us felt wonderfully familiar, the kind that only exists between people who no longer feel the need to fill every moment with conversation. Eventually, Ryan reached into his backpack and pulled out the old graduation photograph once again. I still cannot believe we looked this young, he joked. I laughed. Speak for yourself. We studied the picture for a few quiet moments before Ryan smiled thoughtfully. Do you realize something? He asked. Every version of us in every photograph always looks happy simply because we were together. I looked at the faded image and realized he was right. Whether we were awkward teenagers, nervous college graduates, or exhausted young professionals, the constant had never been the places we visited or the events we celebrated. It had always been each other. As the evening grew cooler, Ryan quietly said, I spent years believing I needed the perfect future. What I actually needed was the courage to stop running from the life that already felt like home. I looked across the calm water glowing beneath the moonlight and understood exactly what he meant. The greatest gift our story had ever given us was not that everything worked out perfectly. It was that we finally discovered lasting happiness begins the moment two people choose honesty, kindness, and each other, day after ordinary day, without ever needing to pretend again. When autumn returned once again, I realized that some places never stop holding memories. They simply begin creating new ones. Ryan and I drove back to the lake for the annual community festival that had quietly become one of our favorite traditions. Small wooden booths lined the shore selling homemade crafts, fresh apple cider, local honey, and paintings created by artists from nearby towns. Children laughed as they chased colorful leaves across the grass, while acoustic music drifted through the cool afternoon air. We wandered slowly from one booth to another without any particular destination, enjoying the simple pleasure of having nowhere else we needed to be. At one booth, an elderly photographer displayed framed pictures of lakes, forests, and mountain trails captured over several decades. Ryan stopped in front of one photograph, showing two empty chairs at the end of a weathered dock during sunrise. That reminds me of us, he said quietly. I smiled. Because of the dock? He shook his head. Because whoever owned those chairs probably spent years returning to the same place with someone who mattered. His words stayed with me as we continued walking. They reminded me that traditions are not really about locations. They are about the people who make ordinary places unforgettable. Later that afternoon, we joined a small charity auction raising money for the Community Art Center where I had volunteered earlier that year. One of the featured pieces was a watercolor painting of a peaceful lake beneath an autumn sunset. Ryan noticed me looking at it for several minutes before quietly placing a bid. When the auction ended, the painting belonged to us. I laughed in surprise. You did not have to do that. Ryan smiled warmly. I know. He glanced at the artwork before looking back at me. But every home deserves something that reminds it where its happiest story began. Hearing him say the word home no longer made me think about buildings or addresses. It made me think about every ordinary morning we had shared, every difficult conversation we had survived, and every quiet promise we continued keeping without needing to speak them aloud. As evening approached, festival volunteers invited everyone to gather near the shoreline for a lantern ceremony celebrating hope and new beginnings. Families, friends, and neighbors each received a small paper lantern with space to write a wish or reflection before placing it gently onto the calm water. Ryan handed me a pen without saying anything. I looked down at the blank paper for several moments before writing only a single sentence. Thank you for leading me home. Ryan smiled after reading it, then wrote his own message before folding the lantern closed. I never asked what he wrote because somehow I already knew it came from the same place in his heart. Together we watched dozens of glowing lanterns drift slowly across the lake until they became tiny lights reflected beneath the evening sky. The peaceful scene reminded me that life rarely gives us perfect certainty. Instead, it gives us opportunities to choose honesty again and again, even after the hardest decisions have already been made. As we walked back toward the parking lot beneath a sky filled with early stars, Ryan slipped the framed watercolor carefully into the back seat before smiling at me with the same quiet warmth that had first made me feel safe all those years ago. In that moment, I understood that our future would never be defined by the wedding that never happened. It would always be defined by the courage we found afterward, the kindness we chose every day, and the countless ordinary moments that continued, proving the greatest love stories are not built in a single unforgettable night, but in a lifetime of choosing each other. Several years have passed since that autumn weekend when two lifelong friends finally chose honesty over fear, and I have come to believe that the most meaningful stories are never defined by the day everything changed. They are defined by all the ordinary days that follow. Ryan and I still begin most Saturday mornings the same way we always have. 2 cups of coffee sit on the kitchen counter while sunlight slowly fills the room, and we spend the first hour of every weekend talking about books we want to read, places we hope to visit, and the little moments from the previous week that somehow became our favorite memories. Sometimes we laugh until neither of us can remember how the conversation even started. Other times we simply enjoy the comfort of quiet, knowing that silence shared with the right person can say more than words ever could. The watercolor painting from the Autumn Festival now hangs above the fireplace in our living room. Every visitor comments on the peaceful lake and glowing sunset without realizing they are looking at the place where our lives quietly found their true direction. The framed graduation photograph sits beside it, reminding us that even when we believed we were only best friends, life was already writing a much larger story than either of us understood. Every year we return to the lake, carrying coffee, sandwiches, and that same old photograph. We sit on the weathered dock, laugh at the memories we once thought were ordinary, and create new ones without trying too hard. The dock has become less of a destination and more of a reminder that the places where we tell the truth often become the places we treasure forever. Not long ago, we received a handwritten card from Daniel. He shared that he had built a happy life in his new city, surrounded by supportive friends and meaningful work. He thanked us once again for choosing honesty before making promises that could never have been completely true. Ryan folded the letter carefully after reading it and smiled with quiet gratitude. "I always hoped he would find happiness," he said. "I think we all did." I nodded because that was the ending every kind heart deserved. Looking back now, I no longer think our story was ever about a canceled wedding. It was about two people who spent decades believing love was supposed to arrive as something unexpected, only to discover it had been patiently growing inside countless ordinary moments all along. It was hidden in early morning coffee, late-night phone calls, long drives without destinations, shared laughter after difficult days, and the unwavering certainty that no matter what happened, one person would always show up when the other needed them most. If someone asked me today what love truly looks like, I would not describe grand gestures or perfect timing. I would describe loyalty that survives changing seasons, friendship that quietly becomes the foundation of something deeper, and the courage to choose truth even when it changes every plan you once believed was certain. Because in the end, life did not reward us for having the perfect future mapped out. It rewarded us for finally being honest enough to walk toward the future that had been waiting for us all along. And every time we stand together at the edge of that familiar lake, watching the evening light dance across the water, I silently remember the lesson that changed everything. Home is never found in a ceremony, a destination, or a carefully written plan. Home is the person who has been walking beside you through every ordinary chapter, patiently waiting until both of you are finally brave enough to recognize that you arrived long ago.